All right, we're talked about energy through the biosphere. We talked about the 6 forms of energy, the law of energy, how energy gets transferred, the explanation of that transfer, and now I'm going to talk about how energy gets transferred through organisms. So the start of all energy is the sun. The sun will enter plants, which are called autotrophs or producers, so that they can make their own food, which in a sense is chemical energy. This chemical energy is actually sugar or glucose. You have to know that because you have to know the full reaction of photosynthesis. Some other producers on Earth are also bacteria, and they produce energy from heat in the hydrothermal vents. They take in the carbon dioxide, they take in the water, and they take in sulfur, but the start of the energy is heat instead of solar through photosynthesis. And this heat energy will produce glucose again, same product. So you have similar reactants, which is CO2, water. The difference is you've got hydrogen sulfide or any sulfur compound, I accept, and heat. You have to make sure you know that heat is a reaction. And then the products would be, and I'll do the products in blue, the products would be glucose and another sulfur compound. You don't have to say what type of sulfur compound, you just have to say sulfur compound. Now, once producers have the energy, it goes to what's called primary consumers or heterotrophs. Let's just say consumers / heterotrophs. And then my primary consumer would be my herbivores. Let me make this bigger so you could see it properly. My primary consumer is my herbivore, okay? What herbivores eat is plants. They are feeding off autotrophs and producers. Secondary, third level, and fourth level consumers or heterotrophs are all going to be carnivores. They eat meat. So you have producers who make their own food, and they're taking energy from the sun, if they're plants, and converting it into chemical energy, which is sugar. If it's bacteria, if you're bacteria in hydrothermal vents or in the deep ocean, you're going to go through chemosynthesis, which is again making their own food and making glucose, but they're using heat, okay? Then the only food or the examples of organisms are going to be based on plant producers. So herbivores will eat the plants, secondary consumers will be carnivores. Now, if we're looking at these fish, and let's say I put a little plant here, and obviously it should be a marine plant, but I'm just going to add this plant right here, and this fish is eating this plant. My plant would be the producer. My orange fish, or my first fish, would be, and I'm going to change all this, would be the primary consumer, and that is called an herbivore. My second fish would be a secondary consumer or a primary carnivore. And my whale would be third level consumer or secondary carnivore. Please make sure to make those corrections in your notes, because I really was calling the first fish eating another fish, but in a sense I just added the plant so you know what it's eating. So the plant would be the producer, which is making its own food. The first fish, this little orange guy, would be the primary consumer, which is eating plants. The second fish would be the secondary consumer. Friends, as they walk in, other consumers that are not necessarily in this order, they could be eating anything. If you eat both plants and animals, or you feed off those, these are kind of like terms to describe types of feeders. Animals, if you feed off both plants and animals, you're an omnivore. If you feed off remains of dead organisms, or you're an organism that waits for organisms to die to feed off them, you're a scavenger. Organisms that feed off organic matter are called detrivores. They are usually in the bottom, like of the ocean or in the soil. They are called detrivores. They are not the end of the breakdown of matter. Even though they break down matter, decomposers will always be the final breakdown. And they are mushrooms, bacteria, other organisms that are going to return the nutrients back into the cycle. All right, to be clear, we left off here, so I'm right here. It was part of the notes. If you downloading the notes into a separate file, we didn't finish this slide, this would be the separate file, okay? If you're putting them together, we're right here. So what is a series of energy transformations called? Anybody know? Food chain. Good job. The reason why I hide this word and I show you the definition is because I want you to be very clear that a food chain, when you see a food chain, you are witnessing a series of energy transformations, okay? So if I'm going to show this series, in which direction is the energy being transferred? To the right or to the left? To the right. Organisms feed to the left, but the energy is being transferred from a plant to a mouse, from the mouse to the snake, and from the snake to the fox. The transformations go from the organism that has the energy or the higher amount of energy to the organism that's receiving the energy. And you're going to get it backwards because you're thinking of the feeding relationship. But the relationship, this is showing transformations of energy. That's what this unit is about. Energy being transferred through the biosphere or through the ecosystem. Picture, so you're going to have to take a picture to put it in there. But what is a network of food chains called? Food web. So go ahead and snap a picture of this. I'm sorry, I covered it because I didn't want you to see the arrows. I'll zoom into it. Whoops, over zoom. Examples of questions I'm going to ask you from this food web. Who can name for me the producer of this food web? There's two options. Algae. How do you know it's algae? Because there's no arrow coming into algae, which means algae is producing the energy of that food web, okay? Where did algae get the energy from? The sun. So if I had a diagram, the sun would be providing energy to algae, yes? Algae is providing energy. Who feeds off algae? Limpets only, yes? Who feeds off mussels? Only? Octopus? Starfish? We got a lot. Those are the types of questions I am going to ask you. Where is the energy of the starfish coming from? Or something along those lines. Starfish obtains its energy from, okay? Things like that. Then I'm also going to apply this and this to those diagrams, which we're going to talk about today, okay? So, what is this called? Food pyramid. So when you have a food, that's wrong, by the way. A food pyramid would have cereal at the bottom and then fats, right? So what kind of pyramid is this? An energy pyramid. I always get the word food pyramid. It never fails. So this is an energy pyramid. And we already learned that in every energy transformation, what happens to energy? Energy is lost as what? Heat. So it's not necessarily, gone. It's just the good, high quality energy or useful energy gets transferred and the majority of the energy gets lost as heat. How much of this energy gets transferred and how much gets lost? 10% gets transferred, 90% gets lost, so only 10% becomes useful energy. Now you're going to be given this energy pyramid. Always at the bottom are my producers. Always, okay? And you work your way up. Second level is going to be organisms that eat producers. Third level is going to be organisms that eat the producer. It's always going to be that. I'm not going to fake you and put a different organism at the bottom. Producers go at the bottom. You cannot have an energy pyramid without producers because they produce the energy from the sun. You see the sun coming in. I'm also going to give you units, okay? Decomposers belong where on this pyramid? How many of you think decomposers belong at the top? How many of you think differently? Where do decomposers belong? How many of you think the bottom? How many of you think differently? Don't think top or bottom. Where do they belong? Everywhere where there is, fill in the blanks. Death or decay is what's happening. Death or waste. If an organism dies or an organism produces waste, then you have decomposers. They don't belong in the energy pyramid. They belong wherever death or waste is produced. Okay? That's why you're seeing arrows going out. You're also seeing the arrows being lost as heat. And you're also seeing this. What is biomass by definition? Bio means mass is weight, matter, living matter. So biomass is the matter that's being transferred through this pyramid. And the shape of the pyramid describes two things. Energy's loss. So the higher you go up the pyramid, the less energy an organism obtains. And the higher you go up the pyramid, the less amount of organisms there are. And the higher you go up the pyramid, the less amount of organic matter there is. Okay? Try to fill in this pyramid. Go. If you're like this, you got your work cut out for you, okay? What goes at the bottom always? I already told you. Producers. What's another word for a producer? Autotrophs. So those are two vocabulary words that you have to recognize are my organisms that make their own food, organisms that use the sunlight to produce energy, a process called photosynthesis, right? If my producers or my plants have 57 calories of energy, how many calories does my mouse have? 5.7 calories, right? And what do we call my mouse? What type of feeder? Primary consumer. What's another word for consumer? Heterotrophs. So here are all my heterotrophs. That's the word I was looking for. My yellow's a heterotroph, my orange is a heterotroph, and my pink is a heterotroph because the only producer or autotroph goes at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, if you are a primary consumer, what do you eat? You're an herbivore. You eat plants, okay? And yes, you could be second level primary consumer and feed off bacteria that makes its own food. But I'm not going to do any food chains in the deep ocean until we start learning about the deep ocean, okay? Secondary, what? Consumer, my snake, is also called a primary carnivore because it's eating the meat from the mouse. How many calories does my snake have? What? 0.57. Let's put a 0 because sometimes it's hard to see the point and I don't want you to get that wrong, okay? So 0.57. I even made that mistake. What about my pink? Or my fox? 0.057. What are they called? Third level consumers or secondary carnivores, okay? So this is an exact replica of what we did on this day, okay? Except we did it through a pyramid. If we did it through a food chain, what would my grass be? Producer. What would my mouse be? Primary consumer, right? Same thing, okay? If I gave you calories here, they would be transferred. It is the same thing. But this energy pyramid can also, or these levels on the pyramid can also be called, trophic levels. So I want you to know that. So if you see that in your notes, levels equal trophic levels. If you see that on your test or on the AP exam, you know what that word means, okay? All right. Now, something else you need to know about is productivity and systems, which we've been talking about. We're just kind of explaining them now. When you see the word productivity, what comes to your mind? What does it sound like? What? Producers. Underline the word productivity and put the word producers. What do you know producers do? Produce what? They use sun's energy or heat energy to produce their own energy. Remember that. In this diagram, who's producing? What are they using? The sunlight to produce what? Energy. What kind of energy? Chemical. Don't forget that. They're taking sunlight to make chemical energy, and we're going to call this chemical energy my organic energy, right? Chemical energy that's organic energy in the form of sugar or glucose. How do they make that? During what process? Photosynthesis. We're practicing fill in the blanks. Essentially, this is known as gross primary productivity. Gross meaning this is the total amount of energy a plant can produce from sun. Gross is the total. But the total is not always what the plant can actually use, because during that process of making glucose, we know what happens to energy. Two things. It gets lost as heat, and this molecule that plants make, which they store, right, also gets used by other parts of the plant. What do glucose get used for in a plant? Look at the diagram and it'll tell you. This is all about energy, right? Glucose is a molecule of energy. What can glucose be used for by the plant? It stores it as its food energy or its fuel, but glucose can also be used to do what? You learned this in bio. Yes. Cellular respiration. So the net productivity is going to take what's made and subtract it from what's used for cellular respiration. Plants use glucose to make molecules of ATP, which will allow cell function. So that's a loss for the plant because the cell's using it. So that's what we call net primary productivity. Bless you. At the top. Respiration, what goes here? Same thing. And this would be glucose, okay? This would be the gross primary productivity. And the reason this is net is because it's telling you this is what the plant is using. This is what the plant made. This is what the plant can use for itself. This is what the plant loses to cell function. We've been talking about systems the whole time. The system, matter cycling is a system. Matter comes in at some point into the system and comes out at some point of the system. Can come in anywhere from the environment. It can flow, and then it can, or cycle, output, and turn into a cycle. Matter. Energy comes into the system, flows, and exits the system, never cycling back into the system. But that's just a definition of a system. A loop or a feedback loop is when there's going to be a change that's going to redirect the system in some way. Have you heard of feedback loops? You did in bio. You just don't remember them. I'm going to tell you from the get-go. When in doubt, the answer is going to be positive feedback loop in this class. Every environmental problem is a positive feedback loop. No. I lie. Every example of a loop in environmental science is a positive feedback loop. That's the correct wording. Now, when you hear the word positive, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Good. And in positive feedback loops, that is not necessarily the case. It is usually bad. So to learn my notes better, I would go like this because it's not necessarily good. Because you're going to think positive and you're going to think good. And there's going to be a good example there, but the answer is usually a negative. Sadly, our loops that are positive feedback loops are usually bad. Why are they bad? Because whatever's happening to that system is causing the change to go in the same direction. So, for example, the output of a system leads to what? What? Sure, input. I like it. input, which is basically restart. So here is an example of temperature rising, which leads to Arctic sea ice melting, which causes darker, more absorption and more heat to be released, which causes temperature to rise. Positive feedback loop. Okay? I have to tell you about a negative feedback loop, but I'm telling you that will not be in ever. It's not going to happen. The answer is always going to be positive feedback loop. And we're going to learn probably like 5 different examples. Right now, you only have 1. So all you can do on the test is define a positive feedback loop, identify a positive feedback loop, or provide 1 example of a positive feedback loop. But here's what a negative feedback loop is, okay? It's not always bad, because that's not what the word means. But if you set your AC to 77, right? And your house is at 78 degrees, what happens to the AC unit? It turns off. Wait, if your house is 78 degrees and you set your air to 77, what happens to your air? It turns on because your house is warmer than what you want it to be. Yes? Once your house reaches 77 degrees, what happens to the AC? It turns off. Unless if you have it on, that's if it's on auto, right? And if the house goes back up to 78, what happens? It turns on. So it doesn't cause a change in the same direction. It causes a change to go from here to there to here to there, okay? That's a negative feedback loop. And guess what? We're done. Good question. Positive. Why do they call it positive? It's really negative. I'm giving you negative examples, but the reality is positive means more in the same direction. Not good or bad, just more of the same thing.